So here's some questions to ponder. How often do we make others responsible for our internal state or our outer circumstances? How often do we pin our internal well-being onto our outer circumstances? How often do we fall back on the past ways of thinking to solve a problem? So these are just things to mull over as I start my talk. So here's a story to get the ball rolling. Two monks were making a pilgrimage to venerate the relics of a great saint. During the course of their journey, they came to a river where they met a beautiful young woman dressed in expensive finery and the latest fashion. She was very afraid of the current and asked the brothers if they might carry her across the river. The younger and more exacting of the brothers was offended at the very idea and turned away with an attitude of disgust. The older brother didn't hesitate and quickly picked the woman up on his shoulders, carried her across the river, and set her down on the other side. She thanked him profusely and went on her way, and the brother waded back through the waters to join his brother. The monks resumed their walk, the older one in perfect equanimity and enjoying the beautiful countryside, while the younger brother grew more and more brooding and distracted, so much so that he could keep his silence no longer and suddenly burst out, "Brother, we are taught to avoid contact with women, and there you were, not just touching a woman, but carrying her on your shoulders." The older monk looked at the younger one with a loving, pitiful smile and said, "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river. You are still carrying her." So as I began to put together this talk, I came up with two premises. The first one, every situation deserves a unique, creative, and loving response. Thus, we declare our independence from the past. It's about rigidity versus flexibility. The older monk was able to act out of his wisdom. He understood the deeper meaning of the vow, which was to not let outer circumstances interfere with our spiritual connection. He was able to allow his higher wisdom to direct him to a loving and creative response to the problem at hand. He knew that an act of kindness was a deeper declaration of his faith. He was able to be flexible about how to handle the challenge. His internal state remained calm and loving. The younger monk wasn't able to surrender his preconceived ideas, and thus he allowed the brother's response to upset him. His response represents our old, rigid, and sometimes unloving responses, as well as our propensity to dwell in the past. In my own life, I have an example of each one. When my kids were in high school, I went back to the classroom as a substitute teacher. And you know what that can be like. It can be pretty challenging. However, I also had about 10 years as an educator under my belt, and I was also a student of Unity at that time. I had been in Unity for about 10 years. And so I felt well equipped to kind of come back and take this on. I got my first test not long after, one of my first jobs that I got. I was teaching English. And one of the students was particularly challenging. She had copped an attitude. She took one look at me and decided that I was the enemy and didn't have to listen to me, didn't have to do anything I said, and just really dug her heels in. And in that moment, I paused because she was trying to drag me into a power struggle. You know what that's like. When someone wants to get you in a power struggle, that's lose-lose, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, stay calm, breathe, what do you know? And I'm pulling out all my Unity lessons. And in that moment, I got this download, and I began to really notice things about her that I could compliment her on. One of which was, you were really great at attitude. But I meant it. I was like, wow, you got this down, and because it was obvious that for whatever reason in her life, that was how she had to deal with things, to cop an attitude. But I also was noticing how she was very aware of how she dressed. She dressed very nicely for a student, and so I began to engage her in that sort of silly banter. And I got her attention off the fact that I was the substitute and I was in charge. And we began to just have this quiet little banter. And then it all went away. It just dissolved. It just went away. And she energetically joined the class again. And all was well. And so I was very grateful that I was able to stay in present moment in that time. So now, what about a rigid response? I got a really good example from my own life. So in my graduate school, I took a class in spiritual direction. And one of the assignments was they gave us some scenarios, and we were required to write up a little thing about how we would handle this particular scenario. And at that point, I'd had even more unity teachings under my belt. And I was feeling a little smug. Like, I got this. This is going to be a piece of cake. You know how you get that way? So I read the scenario, and I'm like, I'm just writing, and I'm writing, and I'm just having a great time going, because I know I'm right. I mean, I'm like, yeah. And I get my paper back, and it's a sea of red ink. And the teacher's making comments like, what? Are you kidding? Like, really? And I was shocked. I was just shocked. Like, me? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I mulled it over, and I meditated about it, and I was praying about it. And I'll never forget this. I was driving in my car, and I got the download about why I was wrong. It was in that instant. I knew why I was wrong. Because I had been coming from my preconceived ideas about what was right, okay? About what should have happened, all those kinds of things. I was in a very rigid place, even in my, I would call it rigid enlightenment. Right? Some of us have that. Some of us, we get a little judgy about people who are judgy. I noticed that in myself, right? So I went back to the teacher and I said, thank you. I get it. This was a very wonderfully humbling lesson, and thank you. And he was very loving about it. He wasn't, he knew that I was the dumb, that he knew where I was going, and he was like, well, I'm glad you came back to your senses, have a seat, let's go on to class, right? So we have to think about, in every given moment, there is an elegant response, there's a loving response. There's a unique and creative response. So here's a little exercise. I want you to close your eyes and think of a challenge you encountered lately. And just think about, go over in your mind how you handled it. Do you feel peaceful about how you solved it? Could you have been more creative or more flexible in how you solved it? And how might you have handled it differently if you could go back and do it again? And is there a particular emotion from the past that might have caused you to not handle it in the most loving way? Now, go back to that same challenge and envision how you would have liked to have handled it. What could you have done differently, if anything? Is there something you could have said differently? Is there an action you could have taken? Or maybe an action that you shouldn't have taken? And how does that feel? Call up the feeling. How does it feel to know how to handle that in a more loving and creative way. Okay. On to premise 2. Our internal state is not dependent upon our outer circumstances. Thus, we declare our independence from our circumstances. We have the power to change our internal state. Our spiritual practice requires us to regularly take inventory of our internal state, lest we become out of balance. But what if we could go a step further and become the fulcrum, independent of what might be swirling around us? So here's my little... So what if we're the triangle? What if we're simply the fulcrum? This is an image given to me by one of my spiritual teachers, and it's really has helped me to maintain my internal calm, because I'm the fulcrum. So close your eyes for just a sec. Imagine what it would like to be that fulcrum. You're independent of all the stuff that's swirling around. You're the fulcrum. Okay. So think about, call up an experience, another experience that wasn't so pleasant maybe. Just think of something, an unpleasant memory. Not too bad though, don't go to really bad places. Just something mildly irritating, okay? Call that up. And now, again, imagine that you are now the fulcrum. Just be that fulcrum. You're independent of that negativity. Just be the calm. Be the eye of the storm. Just be the fulcrum. And all is well inside of you. All is well. And just see that annoyance just dissolving away. Okay. Now, that being said, sometimes we just have to surrender to situations. Because whatever it is, it's got us. And in that moment, the most creative thing we could do perhaps is just simply to surrender. And the example from my own life is a couple of months ago, I had a fairly dramatic ER visit. And it was a situation where I had this severe vertigo and just could barely even get off the floor because it was just horrible. And they called the medics. And I remember being in present moment, suffering mightily. But there was also a piece of me that was watching this, going, wow, this really stinks. I used a stronger word. This really stinks. And then this part of me is just suffering and just miserable. And this part's going, wow. And I'm hearing the sirens come down the street going, whoa, that's for you. Whoa. And I'm just, it's like I had two of me, and my body is just going through this horrible thing, and there's a piece of me outside watching me go through this horrible thing. And I realize I just have to surrender to this. I just got to let them take care of me. I got to let them take me to the hospital. I got to let them do whatever they're going to do. Because my pattern is, as you guys know, is to, I'm in charge. I got this, right? And so this was the universe's way of saying, no, in this moment, the most creative and loving thing you can do is surrender. Let them take care of you. It'll be okay. And it was fine. It was not a major thing. It wasn't a serious thing. So just remember that when things are swirling around, that might be the most creative, loving thing you can do, is just to surrender and be with whatever's going on. Okay? So that's my little caveat to my declarations. Now, here's another exercise to come back, because the premise is that most of the time when we're not surrendering, we have the power to change our internal state. Like, as I was preparing to give this talk, and I'm driving in traffic, it's always traffic here, because that's our most challenging classroom in this area is traffic, right? That's where we get to practice our spiritual principles, in traffic. So I'm driving down the road, and there's some kind of slowdown, back, way back, and I'm like, and I noticed, my initial response was, oh, and then I'm like, well, wait a minute, you're writing this talk on creativity. What could be the most creative thing you could do? And I was like, yay, traffic jam. I get to use this. This is a test. I get to use the traffic jam to see if I can maintain my center. Yay. See what I mean? We can change our state. I don't have control over the traffic jam, but I have control over how I interact with the traffic jam, right? And so I came up with this little graphic to help you think about when you find yourself kind of whining internally about something, or berating yourself about something, or judging something. You want to think about what's going on inside. Why am I doing that? Am I going back to the past? Am I anticipating the future? So what I want you to say to yourself is this. What, me worry? Remember him from back? Okay. Hold that graphic. What, me worry? Okay. So think about that. Why do I have to worry? But even more so, we're going to go over to another one. Oh, I went back. There. Stop in the name of love, folks. So close your eyes. Close your eyes. Think of an annoyance. Think of an annoyance. What feeling is that calling up right now? Am I annoyed? Am I angry? Am I fearful? What emotion has just grabbed my attention? What emotion has just kind of grabbed the steering wheel of my internal state? Got that? Now, call up the Supremes and say internally, stop in the name of love. Let's actually try that out loud. I think that would be fun. Ready? Stop in the name of love. So when something's trying to hijack your peace of mind, just call up the Supremes. Invoke the love. Invoke the Supremes, okay? Stop in the name of love. Just do that, okay? And then we'll go back to Alfred E. Newman, who says, what? Me worry? Right? Okay. So now, we have our spiritual tools. We're going to think about being in present moment. We're going to remember that we can change our state. We're going to stop in the name of love, okay? And we're going to remember that our spiritual tools, prayer, meditation, loving kindness, we're all here because we're practicing these spiritual tools together, okay? And so every situation that comes to us, we can have a unique and loving response. We don't have to keep knee-jerking it, right? Every situation is a unique, loving, and creative response. And if it's not, you just stop in the name of love and say, I choose differently, right? I choose to see this differently. Because our happiness comes from the inside out. And we're the fulcrum. We're the fulcrum. And so I'm going to end with a slide that I love and words of the Dalai Lama. Do not let the behavior of others destroy your inner peace. So let's affirm together. Together, I declare my independence from old patterns of thought and outer appearances. And I affirm that there is an elegant and creative response to every situation I encounter. I affirm my power to change my state. And so it is.